Hey everybody, Pastor Andrew here. I'm here with your Holy Week devotional for Thursday. So, what happened on Thursday? Well, in Matthew's account, he records Thursday's events in chapter 26, beginning in verse 17. And I'm not going to read all of that for you right now, but I encourage you to read Matthew chapter 26, verses 17 through 46 if you get a chance today. But here's the summary. So, Jesus and his disciples celebrate the Passover meal together in an upper room of a house in Jerusalem. Jesus, while they're there, he instructs them on some key things, and they sing a hymn together. And then after supper, they go out to the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus, of course, knowing the significance of the next day's events that are about to take place, he goes and spends time praying to the Father by himself. So I want us to focus on today's devotion on the meaning of the Passover meal that Jesus and the disciples were partaking in together, and the significance that that happens the day before Jesus is crucified. So first of all, this is no coincidence, right? This was God's plan all along, that Jesus would be crucified, not just on any random day of the year, but on this day, the day the Jews celebrated, or the day after the Jews celebrated the Passover meal. Now, why is that significant? Well, the Passover was a celebratory meal that led into a week-long feast of unleavened bread, they called it. So this feast in the Passover was a time that the Jews got together with their families to remember and celebrate God liberating them from slavery in Egypt. And that happened back in Exodus chapter 12. So the Israelites were slaves to the Egyptians for 430 years. Now, that's a long time. That's a long time for Abraham's descendants, the true people of God, to be in slavery, right? Because you see, a slave has no identity of their own. They have no real inheritance, no real freedom. And we're talking about the people of God here. So they were slaves like that for 430 years. But God sent Moses to bring them out of slavery, to lead them to freedom, and to give them an inheritance, right? The promised land. So here's the way that happened. God sent 10, and again, this is back in Exodus chapter 12. God sent 10 plagues on the Egyptians. And after the final one, Pharaoh had enough, because on the final plague, because of the sins of Pharaoh and the Egyptians, God executed judgment in the land. The firstborn life of everyone in Egypt was taken on that night by God. But God provided a way out of this. He provided a way to be saved from his judgment. If you had sacrificed a lamb and spread its blood over your doorpost, this covering of blood would spare them from God's wrath. He would pass over them and they would be saved. So that's what happened. And then Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. They were finally a free people after 430 years of slavery. Now, fast forward all the way to first century Jerusalem, where Jesus, a Jew and a descendant of those people, is now celebrating this event with his disciples. So there, on that Thursday night, the day of Passover, when Jesus breaks the bread and gives them the wine, they are reminded that a blood sacrifice is necessary for God's wrath to pass over them. But this time it will not be a literal lamb. It will be the Lamb of God, Jesus himself. This time his blood will cover not their doorposts, but their hearts. This time he will be the firstborn who takes the wrath of God's judgment. And this time he will be better than Moses. He will lead his people out of a spiritual slavery and bondage to sin and to death. You see, you and I, we were living in slavery before we knew Christ. We were a people with no identity, no real inheritance, eternally speaking, no real freedom, because our sin had separated us from the living God. But because of Jesus' sacrifice for us, we are now God's people, free to live for him on this earth and with him forever in eternity one day. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 and 10 say this: "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." That's the good news for us as followers of Jesus, the people of God today. So tomorrow is Good Friday, and I'll see you guys then.